Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today we're going to talk about the cortical control of motor functions. You know, in the last lectures of motor functions, we talked about spinal cord, brainstem, cerebellum, basal ganglia, and today is the last area of the motor control, which is the highest area, is the cerebral cortex. Our objectives here is to recognize the cerebral cortical areas. I think you have already known some of them in anatomy. Delineate the cortical control of the corticospinal pathways. This is the main one that comes from the cerebral cortex, and interpret some of cortical abnormalities. As you remember, always we see this slide in every part of the motor system. As you as you know, we talked about here the spinal cord first. Then we talked about the feedback that's coming from the muscle spindle and the Golgi tendon that goes to the cerebellum to tell the cerebellum about the actual movements, how it means. It means that how the length is changed, how the tension is changed. And then the cerebellum, as you know, the cerebellum receives inputs from the cortex, cortico-pontocerebellar, and the cortico-pontocerebellar tells the cerebellum about the intention. And the cerebellum will do what it will do, as you remember from also the inferior ellipse. They will compare the actual movements with the intended movements, and they go with correction that's sent to the cerebral cortex through the VA-VL part of the thalamus. And do you remember that the VA-VL, ventro-anterior ventrolateral part of the thalamus, is the motor part of the thalamus? Then we talked about the brainstem area here. We talked about the descending fiber from the brainstem, reticulospinal, vestibulospinal. We talked about the red nucleus here. The red nucleus receives LC from the cerebral cortex. And last time we talked about the basal ganglia, and we said that the basal ganglia is concerned with control of patterns of movements. يعني ايش؟ يعني الحركات النمطية. The last thing we're going to talk about is here the cerebral cortex. Okay. Okay. The motor cortex is divided into three sub-areas. We have the primary motor cortex, which is found in the pre-central gyrus. You remember the primary sensory cortex is found in the post-central gyrus. Here, the primary motor cortex is found in the pre-central gyrus, which is also like the sensory. It is topographically organized. And there is, as you remember, there is no equal representation of the cortex to our body. And any area of the cortex that represent any part of our body is proportional to the number of motor units in that area. In that area here, we have fine motor movements elicited by stimulation of the primary motor cortex. So if you stimulate the primary motor cortex, you end with maybe just contraction of a single muscle fiber. Not the primary motor cortex stimulation does not give us purposeful movement. Purposeful movements need sequential contraction of different areas of the primary cortex. Then we have the premotor area, a premotor, which is in front of the primary motor area, which is also topographically organized. As you remember, we said that any part of the motor system is topographically organized in any part of the basal ganglia, any part of the cerebellum. And when topographically organized, similar to the primary cortex, stimulation results in movement of muscle groups, a group of muscle here to perform purposeful movements. In the premotor area, we have programs for movement. If you stimulate this area will send the stimulus to the primary areas, to different parts of the primary area to give us sequential contraction of different muscle and will give us a purposeful movement. Works, of course, in concert with other motor areas. We have the supplementary motor areas. The supplementary motor area, which is also anterior to the primary area, which is in the top of the cerebral cortex. It is topographically organized, but the topographic organized in the supplementary area gives you a bilateral movement. So stimulation of the supplementary area gives you bilateral movement. This is one thing that's important for the supplementary area. It is bilateral control. Function and concert, of course, of the primary movement provide attitudinal, fixational, or positional movement for the body. You need, say, if you need to write or something like this, you need to fix the other areas uh, for movements to be good. It provides backward movement for fine motor control of arms, hands, and premotor cortex and primary motor cortex. This is here the areas. This is the primary. This is the primary motor cortex, which is in the premotor, in the precentral gyrus. As you see, we have also representation of our body, like the sensory areas, and the representation here is proportional to the number of motor units. And the representation, as you remember from the sensory areas, the representation is contralateral. That means that the right cortex represents the left side of the body, and the left cortex represents the right side of the body. And the representation is upside down. The face is down, and the legs is up, and the representation is proportional to the number of motor units. In front of uh, in front of this area here, we have the premotor area. As you see, the premotor area, we have programs. The lowermost area of the programs is what we call it Broca's area or word formation, which is this is the sensory part of the speech, sensory part of speech, which means that the program, if this area is stimulated, it elicits programs, and the program of talking will send information to the primary areas, which is in front of it. As you see in front of it here is the areas of talking, the vocalization, jot, playing tub. So this is how it works here. So this is called the motor speech area, or Broca's named after the scientist who described it first. Then above it, we have the contralateral eye movement. Above it, this is contralateral eye movement. This is voluntary contralateral eye movement. Then up is head rotation. Then the hand scale movement is in top. The hand scale like writing, typing, whatever. Then in top we have the lower limb movements. See? So this is areas. These areas are found in the premotor area, which means that the programs for talking, the programs for contralateral eye movement, head rotation is found there. If you stimulate there, you will end with purposeful movement. But if you stimulate the primary areas here, if you stimulate the primary, if you stimulate the primary area here, you are going to end with maybe just contraction of a single muscle fiber, not muscle, single muscle fiber of the muscle, which just does not give you any purposeful movement. Okay, this is the representation in the motor, primary motor cortex with the precentral gyrus. Look, see here, the representation is upside down, and the representation in the cortex is disproportional to the size of the body, and it is proportional to the number of, look here to the thumb. The thumb is represented with very large area in the cortex. In fact, in the thumb, you use it for too many movements, for writing, for eating, for whatever. So it has very high number of motor units, and it is represented by very high, very large area in the cerebral cortex. Like also the lips here, also on talking, it is represented very high, very large number, very high, very large area of the cortex. Now here, you might think of it. عندنا هون مرات شركات التأمين على الحياة if you lose your thumb ممكن يعوضوك 50% من التأمين على الحياة. ليش؟ لأن thumb is very important if you lose this area. So located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe, more cortical. So as you remember, the motor area is in the frontal lobe and the sensory area is in the parietal lobe. More cortical areas devoted to those muscles that involved in skilled, complex, delicate movement that have more motor units, i.e. cortical representation is proportional to the number of motor units. Like there in the sensory, it is proportional to the number of receptors. So Broca's area, damage of this area causes decreased speech capability, what we call it aphasia. Aphasia, it is inability to speak. But this is motor one. We call it sometimes expressive aphasia. The person cannot express himself, but he has the idea, because the idea is formed where? It's formed in the Broca, in the vernix area. In the vernix area, which is in the occipito-parieto-temporal area. Closely associated area control appropriate respiratory function for speech command, eye fixation area and head rotation for coordinated head and eye movement. Hand scale area, the hand scale area is on top of the areas here on top of the head rotation, high fix and contralateral eye movement. Damage of this hand scale area causes what we call it motor apraxia, inability to write, inability to perform fine hand movement, to write, type, whatever. Apraxia. Apraxia, A للنفي. Okay. Transmission of cortical motor signals. They are transmitted through corticospinal. Sometimes we call it direct pathway, corticospinal for discrete detailed movements. So stimulation of the corticospinal gives you fine, precise movement of the distal muscle hands. Indirect pathways, you remember the indirect pathways may be the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and the brain stem nuclei. This is the indirect that cause control of the extra cortical or the extra the anti-gravity muscle or extensors. Corticospinal fiber, there are around 34,000 beta cells, which is found in the primary cortex. These are large cells and make up only 3% of the total number. This makes up 3% of the total number of the corticospinal fibers. 97% of the fibers of 1 million fiber of the corticospinal are small diameter fiber. These are large cells. What they do, they conduct small fibers, they conduct background tonic signals. They are important for feedback signals from the cortex to control intensity of the various sensory signals. الفيدباك اللي هو حكيناه بالvestibular system، حكينا corticofugal fiber corticofugal، وين ما كان في فيدباك يعني على الريسبتورز to control the sensitivity of the system, you have a corticofugal fibers. That's coming from the small fibers. This is the corticospinal. You know the corticospinal here. The corticospinal, they come from the motor cortex. They descend in the posterior limb of the internal capsule. And what ascends in the anterior limb? What ascends in the sensory fiber? What is found in the genu here? The genu found the corticobulbar fiber. So they descend in the posterior limb of the internal capsule. بعدين it goes down until it goes to the medulla oblongata. In the medulla oblongata, they decussate. The left fibers, they go to the right lateral corticospinal, and the right goes to the left. Almost 90% or more than 90% of the fibers they decussate, and still there is some fiber they don't decussate. They just run in the anterior column of the spinal cord. So more than 90% they decussate in the pyramids. That's why pyramids يعني زي الأهرامات، مسوين أهرامات هناك. And this is very important area of the medulla. If you have damage of this area, you might have damage of the decussation. Decussation يعني إيش؟ Crossing from one area to the other area. Other pathways from the motor cortex: peds collateral back to cortex, sharpen the boundaries. Fibers to caudate and butamen. You remember that this is the basal ganglia fibers. What we call it corticostriatal, because the caudate and butamen are called striatum. Fibers to the red nucleus, corticorubral, and from there the red nucleus gives down fiber rubrospinal, and the rubrospinal lateral corticospinal, they are excitatory to the flexors and inhibitory to the extensor. That's why they are called sometimes lateral system pathways, which then send axon to the cortex through the rubrospinal. Yes, reticulospinal, especially the medullary reticulospinal, corticomedullary, corticoreticular. And if the medullary reticular formation is stimulated by the cortex, it goes and inhibits the pontine reticulospinal, because the pontine reticulospinal is intrinsically active. It is always active. It has to be checked by the medullary. And we said that if this connection between the cortex and the medullary reticulospinal is cut, that person will have overactivity of the pontine corticospinal and will have what we call the decerebrate rigidity. Therefore, the basal ganglia brainstem receives large number of signals from the cortex. Incoming sensory pathways to motor cortex, subcortical fibers from the adjacent area, especially from somatic sensory ممكن يجي feedback, parietal cortex, and visual and auditory cortex. So there is something what we call it integration between the sensory and motor. Subcortical fiber from opposite hemisphere. This is very important for control of the movements. They come from the opposite hemisphere through what we call that corpus callosum. These are the fibers that connect the two hemispheres. This is the major fiber that connect the two hemispheres. But there are other commissural fibers, anterior commissural fiber and posterior commissural fiber that connect the two hemispheres together. But the major fiber that connect the two hemispheres is the corpus callosum. You might seen this in anatomy. Somatic sensory fiber from VAVL, ventrobasal complex. Sensory fiber from the ventrobasal complex of the thalamus. This is cutaneous and proprioceptive information. and these are important sometimes for motor integration. Incoming fiber from ventrobasal, ventrolateral, ventroanterior nuclei. You know the VAVL, ventroanterior, ventrolateral nuclei. They receive corrective commands from the cerebellum and corrective commands from the basal ganglia. They will pass these commands to the cerebral cortex, as we have noticed when we talked about the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. Fiber from intralaminar nuclei of the thalamus, control of excitability of the motor cortex. Some of these may be pain fibers. Pain fibers. You remember the intralaminar nuclei, centromedian part of the nuclei, they are connected to the basal ganglia too, and they come from the basal ganglia to the centromedian part to the thalamus, and the intralaminar nuclei, they are part of the sensory system. They receive sensory information. Sensory feedback is important for motor control. Feedback from muscle spindle and tactile, they pass to the tactile receptors around the joint, proprioceptor fine tuning. These feedback, they go to the cerebellum through the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, and the cerebellum will send corrective commands back to the cortex. So feedback from muscles, spindle, tactile receptors around the joint, which is Pacinian corpuscle. Pacinian corpuscle. You remember we mentioned that Pacinian corpuscle. So Pacinian corpuscle also around the joint, they give us feedback to the cerebellum, from the cerebellum back to the cortex through the VAVL, ventroanterior ventrolateral. Length mismatches, Mendel causes correction, and the correction, it passes from the cerebellum to the thalamus, to the cortex through the thalamus. Compression of the skin provides sensory feedback. These are around the sensory receptor around the joints, or degree of effectiveness of intended movement. Excitation of spinal motor neurons. Motor neurons in the cortex reside in layer 5. You remember we have 6 layers of the cortex, from down upstairs, upward, from inside, outside, and you remember maybe from your sensory lecture that layer 4 is the afferent area, that all afferent come to the layer 4. Layer 5 and 6 is the efferent area. Excitation of 50 to 100 giant pyramidal cells is needed to cause muscle contraction. Most corticospinal fiber synapse with interneuron. Although some of the corticospinal synapse with the alpha motor neuron directly, and some of the rubrospinal, they synapse with the alpha motor neuron, but they synapse with interneuron, and the interneuron, they synapse with the alpha motor neuron, what we call it, final common pathway. Some corticospinal and rubrospinal neuron synapse directly with the alpha motor neuron, is in the spinal cord, especially in the cerebral, in the cervical enlargement, especially in the cervical enlargement. These motor neurons innervate muscles of the fingers and hands. These are, if the stimulus coming directly to the motor neuron, this means that the movement is more precise, because there is no ما بصير فيها تشتت. No background بكون good background, because there is direct from the corticospinal to the alpha motor neuron. If you synapse with interneurons, this means that the impulse might be dissipated to other areas. This is the final common pathway in the this is the final common pathway in the spinal cord. This receives mostly interneurons through all fibers. This is the corticospinal. It might give you direct. This is the direct here, as you see, direct from the corticospinal to the alpha motor neuron. Also, the corticospinal here might give through interneurons to the alpha motor neuron. And we have might be sensory neurons that are important for reflexes. Propriospinal, this is the tracts that's coming from the front segments. And we have a lot coming from reticulospinal, vestibulospinal to the alpha motor neurons. And here the final common pathway زي ما حكينا في حالة السيربيلم. هذا الفاينل common pathway it receives information from all tracts. كل تراك بيؤدي مثلا واحد اي ام اس بي واحد اي بي اس بي وات ايفر. In the alpha motor neuron we have what we call the grand action potential or grand signal, grand potential. The grand potential is copied and it goes up to the cerebellum through ventral spinocerebellar tract. So the ventral spinocerebellar tract does not take origin from receptor. It takes origin from the alpha motor neuron. It copies the signal that goes to the muscle and it sends it to the spinal cord, to the cerebellum. Sorry, send it to the cerebellum. As you know here, the medullary reticulospinal, rubrospinal, corticospinal, these are called lateral system pathway because they are excitatory to the flexor and inhibitory to the extensor, and they are located in the lateral column of the spinal cord. Now, vestibulospinal and pontareticulospinal, the anterior corticospinal, they are located in the anterior part, anterior column, or they are called medial system pathway because they are stimulatory to the extensor and inhibitory to the flexor. Lesions of the primary motor cortex. Primary motor cortex, if they are destroyed, there is loss of voluntary control over discrete movements of the distal segments of the limb, loss of voluntary movements. Basal ganglia, they have muscle spasticity from loss of inhibitory input that's coming from accessory areas of the cortex that inhibit excitatory brainstem motor control. Also, lesions from the corticospinal, it will give you abnormal reflexes in the leg, which is called Babinski positive. Babinski positive, which means that stimulation of the lateral aspect of the leg, down leg, it will cause upward movement of the big toe and spanning of the other toes. This is called Babinski positive. You will see it in the lab, inshallah. We will demonstrate it in the lab. Thank you. That's all what we have for this lecture.